Have you ever felt that something in your life doesn't quite add up? That a truth, buried deep beneath layers of secrets, is waiting to be uncovered? Tonight, you will hear a story that will leave you breathless. A story of hidden pasts, betrayals disguised as love, and a mystery so tangled that no one is who they seem. When a simple pizza delivery ends with a desperate note from an innocent child, the truth unravels in ways no one could have imagined. But this is just the beginning. A family on the edge, a past that refuses to stay buried, and a final revelation that will change everything. Stay until the end, because what happens in the final moments will leave you speechless. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into a story you'll never forget. The night was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made the world feel paused, as if something was about to break through the stillness. The streets were empty except for the occasional flickering of a street lamp, casting long, distorted shadows against the pavement. Michael Carter adjusted the worn-out cap on his head as he carried a stack of pizzas toward the entrance of an upscale suburban house. The neighborhood was the kind that smelled like wealth. Freshly cut grass, polished driveways, and houses too big for the people who lived in them. He rang the doorbell and waited, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. It was his last delivery of the night, and exhaustion settled deep in his bones. A moment later, the door creaked open just enough for a small hand to push a few bills toward him. His brows furrowed as he looked down and realized the hand belonged to a little girl, no older than 8. She had long blonde hair that framed her pale face, her blue eyes wide and serious. She barely looked at him as she pushed the money forward, her fingers trembling slightly. Michael took the cash automatically, but just as he was about to hand her the pizza box, something else caught his attention. Nestled between the folded bills was a small, crumpled piece of paper. His stomach twisted as he subtly unfolded it, his breath hitching as he read the shaky, childlike handwriting. "Mom and Dad are fighting. Help me." His throat tightened. The girl, standing in the doorway, still didn't meet his eyes. Her shoulders were hunched as if she were expecting someone to pull her back inside at any moment. Michael glanced past her into the house. It was dimly lit, the warm glow of a chandelier illuminating a pristine entryway, the kind that belonged in magazines. But something felt off. Too much quiet, too much stillness. Before he could say anything, the girl quickly closed the door. The click of the lock sent a sharp chill down his spine. He stood there for a moment, gripping the note, his mind racing. Was this a joke? A mistake? But as his eyes drifted to the upstairs window, he saw something that made his breath catch. Behind the sheer curtain, a shadow moved, slow and deliberate, like someone was watching him. A cold dread settled in his stomach. He hesitated for only a second before pulling out his phone. His hands were clammy as he dialed. The ringing felt endless before a calm, professional voice answered. 911, what's your emergency? Michael swallowed hard. I just delivered a pizza to this house, and the kid who answered the door gave me a note. It said her parents were fighting and she needed help. I don't know what's going on, but something doesn't feel right. There was a pause on the other end before the dispatcher spoke again, her voice sharp and alert. Can you confirm the address? Michael quickly read it off the receipt. He could hear the typing in the background, the urgency crackling through the line. Stay there, the dispatcher instructed. Officers are on their way. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as he took a step back from the door. The house remained silent, but something in the air had changed, like the walls themselves were holding a breath. He glanced at the upstairs window again, but the shadow was gone. Michael had delivered to hundreds of houses before. He had seen families laughing over dinner, couples arguing at the doorstep, teenagers blasting music in the background, but never something like this. There was something deeply wrong with that house, something that made the air feel heavy, suffocating. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. And then, the distant wail of sirens cut through the quiet night. Red and blue lights reflected off the polished windows as 2 police cruisers pulled up to the curb. The officers stepped out, their hands resting near their belts as they approached. Michael lifted his hands slightly, showing he was just the delivery guy. You the one who called? One of the officers asked, his sharp gaze assessing him. Michael nodded and handed over the crumpled note. A little girl gave this to me when she paid for the pizza. I didn't see her parents. She looked scared. The officers exchanged glances before one of them knocked on the door. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then, the lock turned, and the door slowly opened. A woman stood there, her blonde hair neatly tied back, her expression the picture of calm. She was beautiful in the kind of way that made her seem untouchable, elegant, poised. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice smooth, practiced. Michael clenched his jaw. Something about the way she stood there, perfectly composed, made his stomach twist. "Ma'am, we received a call about a possible domestic disturbance. We need to check on the welfare of the child in the home," the officer said. The woman's smile didn't falter, but something flickered in her eyes. "There must be some misunderstanding. My husband and I had a small disagreement, but everything is fine." The officer glanced at Michael, who stiffened. He could feel it. Something wasn't right. "Ma'am, may we come in?" For the briefest second, hesitation crossed her face. Then, just as quickly, she stepped aside. "Of course." The officers entered, and Michael lingered at the doorway, unsure if he should leave or stay. He didn't want to walk away from this. Then he heard it. A small sound, almost imperceptible. A muffled sob. The officers heard it too. One of them turned toward the staircase just as a small voice whimpered from above. "Lily!" Michael's blood ran cold. The woman's posture stiffened, and for the first time, a crack appeared in her perfect composure. The officer wasted no time. He moved past her, heading up the stairs. The woman took a step forward, as if she were about to stop him, but the second officer blocked her path. Michael didn't move. He was frozen at the threshold, listening. Then footsteps, the creak of a door, and then the officer's voice, sharp and urgent. "I need an ambulance now." Michael's breath caught. The woman closed her eyes, her lips pressing into a thin line. And in that moment, he knew. She had been hiding something. The sirens returned, louder this time, as paramedics rushed into the house. Michael stepped back, his hands clenched into fists as he watched the night unfold. He didn't know what they found upstairs. He didn't know what had been hidden behind those walls. But as he looked at the woman standing in the doorway, her mask of perfection slipping, he realized one thing. This was just the beginning. The cold morning light seeped through the blinds, casting thin, pale streaks across the walls of Michael Carter's small apartment. He sat on the edge of his unmade bed, staring at the note he had received the night before, his fingers gripping the crumpled piece of paper so tightly that the edges were beginning to tear. "Mom and Dad are fighting. Help me." The words were burned into his mind, circling his thoughts like vultures. He had barely slept, his mind replaying the events over and over. The small, trembling girl at the door, the woman's eerily calm face, the sound of the police officer's voice calling for an ambulance. What had they found upstairs? What had been hidden behind those doors? A sudden knock at his door made him jump. His heart pounded as he stood up, the floor creaking under his weight. He hesitated for a moment before pulling the door open, and there, standing in the dim hallway, was Officer Daniel Harris. He was tall, with a sharp, no-nonsense expression, the kind of man who had seen too much and carried it in his eyes. "Michael Carter?" the officer asked, his voice steady but firm. Michael swallowed hard and nodded. "Mind if I come in?" Michael stepped aside, and the officer entered, his gaze sweeping across the small apartment. It was tidy but worn, an old couch, a stack of unpaid bills on the table, a coffee cup still half full from last night. The air was thick with tension as Michael shut the door behind him. "I assume you want to talk about last night," Michael said, his voice rough from exhaustion. The officer nodded, his expression unreadable. "We have some questions. We need to understand what led you to call 911. Michael ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "The little girl, Lily. She handed me the money for the pizza, but with it, she slipped me this note." He unfolded the paper and held it out. I didn't know what to do, but she looked scared. Something didn't feel right. Officer Harris took the note, reading it carefully. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, he didn't say anything. Then he met Michael's eyes, and there was something in his gaze that sent a chill down Michael's spine. You were right to call, Harris finally said. We found Lily upstairs. She was locked in a small storage room, no windows, no lights. She was dehydrated, disoriented. The paramedics took her to the hospital. Michael's stomach twisted. Jesus! He sank down onto the couch, rubbing a hand over his face. Her parents, what did they say? The officer's mouth pressed into a thin line. Emma and Jack Anderson claim it was an accident, that Lily must have locked herself in by mistake. But, he hesitated. That's not all we found. Michael's pulse quickened. What do you mean? Officer Harris sighed, shifting his weight as if choosing his words carefully. The house was strange, too perfect, like it was staged. Every room was spotless, every picture frame perfectly aligned. But when we got to the master bedroom, there were holes in the walls, small ones hidden behind furniture, like someone had been punching them in secret. And in the basement, we found a locked filing cabinet filled with documents, medical reports, therapist evaluations, old adoption papers. Some of them were about Lily. Others. He trailed off. Michael leaned forward. Others what? Harris hesitated, his fingers tapping against the side of his belt. They weren't about Lily at all. They were about another child. A boy who doesn't exist in any official records. A cold wave of unease washed over Michael. What are you saying? The officer exhaled. We don't know yet, but something about that house isn't right. Michael's mind reeled. He thought back to the shadow he had seen in the upstairs window before the door had closed. Had it been Lily? Or someone else? Where are the parents now? He asked. Emma Anderson is still at home. Jack left early this morning. Said he needed to clear his head. We haven't been able to reach him since. Michael frowned. And Lily? Still at the hospital. She hasn't spoken a word. A heavy silence filled the room. Michael's gaze drifted back to the note in his hand, the small, desperate handwriting. What happens now? He asked quietly. Harris studied him for a long moment before answering. That depends on what we find next. As the officer left, Michael sat motionless, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He had stepped into something far bigger than he had realized. And for some reason, deep in his gut, he knew this wasn't over. Later that night, unable to shake the feeling that he needed to do something, Michael found himself driving toward the Andersons' house. The street was quiet, the house dark except for a single light on in the upstairs hallway. He parked a few houses down, watching, waiting. Then, movement, a figure stepping out onto the front porch. Emma Anderson. She stood there for a long moment, arms crossed over her chest as she stared out at the night. Then, suddenly, she turned her head, her eyes locking onto Michael's car. Michael froze. For a second, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, deliberately, Emma lifted a hand and waved. Not a casual wave, not a greeting, just a slow, deliberate motion, her expression unreadable. Michael's heart pounded. She knew he was watching, and worse, she wasn't surprised. Michael Carter sat in his car long after Emma Anderson had gone back inside. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel as he replayed the moment over and over, the way she had looked directly at him, the eerie calmness in her expression, the way she had waved as if she had been expecting him. Every fiber of his being told him to leave, to drive home, forget about this, and pretend it never happened. But something inside him, something deeper than curiosity, held him there. His phone buzzed against the dashboard, the screen lighting up with an unknown number. His breath hitched before he hesitantly reached for it. Hello! There was silence on the other end. Faint breathing. Then, a small voice whispered, "Don't trust them." Michael's grip tightened around the phone. Who is this? A shaky inhale. Then the line went dead. His stomach twisted. He checked the call log, but the number was unlisted. His pulse thundered as he looked back at the house. Who had just called him? And what exactly wasn't he supposed to trust? Something told him that the answers were inside that house. He killed the engine, stepping out cautiously. The air was thick with the scent of rain from earlier that evening, the pavement still damp beneath his shoes. He moved slowly, his eyes scanning the windows for any sign of movement. The house loomed before him, eerily silent, a place that should have felt like home for someone, but instead radiated an unsettling stillness. The door was locked as expected, but as he reached for the handle, something caught his eye. A faint flicker of movement near the side gate leading to the backyard. His breath quickened. He hesitated only for a second before making his way around, careful not to make a sound. The backyard was pristine, almost too perfect, like everything had been deliberately arranged. A swing set stood motionless, untouched by time, the grass trimmed with unnatural precision. But what caught his attention was the basement door, slightly ajar. Michael stared at it. His mind screamed at him to turn around, to leave while he still could. But his feet moved forward before he could stop himself. The basement smelled of dust and something faintly medicinal, like old antiseptic. His footsteps were nearly silent on the concrete floor as he descended the stairs. The air grew colder, and as his eyes adjusted to the dim lighting, he realized why. There were no old boxes, no forgotten Christmas decorations or broken furniture like most basements. Instead, filing cabinets lined the walls, each drawer meticulously labeled with names and dates. It looked more like an archive than a storage space. Michael's fingers hovered over the metal drawers, his chest tightening. He found one labeled Anderson, Lily, and hesitated only for a moment before pulling it open. Inside, a thick file sat atop a collection of medical documents. His eyes skimmed the words: behavioral evaluations, therapist notes, adjustment difficulties. His stomach twisted as he flipped through the pages. Lily Anderson exhibits recurring dreams of an unknown sibling. Patient insists she remembers another child but lacks factual evidence. Recommendation: continued observation. His hands shook. Another child. The boy Officer Harris had mentioned. The deeper he read, the more unsettling it became. Pages filled with psychologist's notes, records of Lily talking about someone named Eli, someone who didn't officially exist. The handwriting of one therapist caught his attention, a note scribbled hastily in the margins. The girl is remembering too much. A soft creak echoed behind him. Michael froze. His breath stalled in his throat. Then, in the reflection of the metal cabinet, he saw it. Someone standing at the top of the basement stairs. His blood ran cold. He turned slowly, his pulse hammering. Emma Anderson stood there, her expression unreadable, a shadow stretching behind her from the dim hallway light. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly. Michael swallowed hard. His mind raced for an excuse, but there was nothing to say. He had broken into her home, gone through her files. There was no justification. But something about the way she stood there, her shoulders squared but her fingers subtly trembling, made him realize something. She wasn't angry. She was afraid. "You have another child," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't you?" Emma's jaw tightened. For a long moment, she didn't respond. Then, finally, she let out a breath, her voice barely audible. He was never supposed to exist. A chill crawled down Michael's spine. Emma stepped forward, slowly descending the stairs. Her face was carefully composed, but he could see it now, the cracks forming beneath the surface, the exhaustion in her eyes. "I don't know who you think you are, Michael," she murmured, "but you don't want to get involved in this." Michael clenched his fists. "Lily slipped me that note. She asked for help. And I'm not leaving until I know what she was asking to be saved from." Emma let out a humorless laugh, shaking her head. "You think you're the first person to try and save her?" Something in her tone made Michael's stomach drop. She took another step closer. "You're already in this deeper than you realize." Michael's hands tightened around the folder. "Who is Eli?" Emma's expression flickered. Shock, hesitation, something close to grief. but she quickly masked it. You don't want the answer to that. Michael took a step back. His mind was racing. The police are already looking into this, Emma. I found your documents. There are records proving. Proving what? She cut in. That my daughter is confused? That she talks about a boy that never existed? Do you have any idea what you're dealing with? Michael's heart pounded. He wasn't sure anymore. Then, suddenly, Emma's demeanor shifted. Her breathing slowed, her hands unclenched. She looked at him with something close to pity. You're looking in the wrong places, she murmured. Michael frowned. What does that mean? Emma didn't answer. She simply turned, walking up the stairs without another word. When she reached the top, she looked back down at him one last time, her voice quiet. If you really want the truth, start with yourself. Then she was gone, the basement door clicking shut behind her. Michael stood there, his breath uneven, the weight of her words pressing down on him. Start with himself? What the hell did that mean? He turned back to the file cabinet, his eyes darting to another folder, one that hadn't caught his attention before. But now, standing in the silence of that basement, it screamed at him. It was labeled Carter Michael. His chest tightened, his pulse roared in his ears. With shaking hands, he reached forward and pulled it open. And then, everything he thought he knew shattered. Michael Carter's hands trembled as he pulled the file from the cabinet. His breath came in short, shallow bursts as he stared at the bold, printed letters. Carter Michael. His name, his file. In the basement of a house that shouldn't have anything to do with him. The weight of it made his chest tighten, a suffocating pressure settling deep in his ribs. He wasn't sure he wanted to open it, but some part of him, some desperate, relentless part, knew that he had to. His fingers shook as he flipped the cover open. The first thing he saw was a photograph. A boy, around 6 or 7 years old, standing in front of a house that looked eerily familiar. His heart pounded. The child in the photo was him. The same tousled brown hair, the same dark eyes. But something was wrong. There was another boy standing beside him. Michael's breath caught. The second boy looked just like him, identical except for one detail. The other boy had a faint birthmark just below his right ear. His mind reeled. A twin? He didn't have a twin. He had no siblings. His mother had raised him alone, and she had never once mentioned another child. His fingers fumbled through the file, flipping past pages of medical reports, psychological evaluations, old-school transcripts. His vision blurred as he tried to process the words in front of him. Michael Carter and Eli Carter, identical twins, born July 12th. Separated in early childhood due to circumstances that remain unclear. Michael placed in standard adoption. Eli unaccounted for. Michael felt the floor sway beneath him. His heart pounded against his ribs like a trapped bird. He read it again over and over, but the words didn't change. He had a twin who had disappeared. His stomach churned. Why had his mother never told him? And what did the Andersons have to do with this? A sound from upstairs jolted him back to reality. The creak of a floorboard. He stuffed the file back into the cabinet, his breath ragged. He had been down here too long. Emma had already warned him once. If she caught him again, there was no telling what she'd do. He moved toward the stairs, his pulse thundering in his ears. But just as he reached the door, a voice whispered behind him. You shouldn't have found that. Michael spun, his breath catching. But the basement was empty. The silence pressed in around him, heavy and suffocating. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to turn back toward the door. His hand was still trembling as he reached for the knob. He needed answers, and he knew exactly where to start. It was nearly midnight by the time Michael arrived at his mother's old apartment building. The place hadn't changed. Faded paint peeling from the walls, the dim glow of the hallway lights flickering unsteadily. He hadn't been here in years, not since she had passed. But now, standing in front of her old door, the weight of everything pressed down on him, he hesitated for a long moment before finally pushing inside. The apartment was exactly as he remembered, small, cluttered, the faint scent of her old vanilla-scented candles still lingering in the air. He moved slowly, his fingers tracing the edges of the dusty furniture. His mother had never been one to talk about the past. Every time he had asked about his father, she had shut down, her expression unreadable, and she had never once mentioned a brother. But there had to be something. He started in the bedroom, pulling open drawers, flipping through old papers, searching for anything that might explain why his name was in that file, why he had a twin who had been erased from his life. And then he found it, stuffed in the back of the closet, behind old sweaters and forgotten keepsakes, was a shoebox. His fingers trembled as he pulled it out, lifting the lid. Inside were photographs, old faded pictures of him as a child. And there, in several of them, was Eli. The same face, the same eyes. But something was wrong. In the later photos, Eli started to look different. His expression darker, his eyes distant, and then the pictures stopped. Michael flipped through them desperately, searching for anything that explained what had happened to his brother. And then, at the bottom of the box, he found a letter. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded. If you are reading this, it means you have started asking questions. I never wanted you to know. I never wanted you to remember. But it was never my choice. Michael's pulse pounded as he read. You were supposed to be safe. That's why I took you away. That's why I let them erase him. But I can't run from the past forever. And neither can you. His hands shook. His mother had taken him away. But from what? And why had she let them erase Eli? A cold realization settled in his chest. Eli hadn't disappeared. He had been hidden. But by who? And why? A loud knock at the door made him jump. His breath caught in his throat. No one knew he was here. No one was supposed to know. The knock came again, louder this time. He hesitated, then slowly stepped toward the door, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. He reached for the knob, his fingers trembling. And then, from the other side, a voice whispered, "Michael, open the door. It's me." His blood ran cold. It was Eli. Michael's entire body went rigid. The voice on the other side of the door was barely a whisper, but it was unmistakable. It wasn't just the name that froze him in place. It was the way it was spoken, soft yet urgent, familiar yet completely foreign. The way it carried weight, as if the person saying it knew him in ways no one else did. He took a slow, shaky breath, pressing his palm against the door as if he could steady himself with the touch of the wood beneath his fingers. His pulse pounded against his ribs, his thoughts racing too fast to make sense of. Eli? Couldn't be. It wasn't possible. His mother had never mentioned a brother. There were no official records of him. He didn't exist. And yet, here he was, standing on the other side of the door, waiting. Michael's fingers hovered over the doorknob, his instincts warring against each other. Every logical part of his brain screamed at him to leave, to run. But another part, the part that had been unsettled ever since he found that file, the part that had felt an invisible weight on his chest ever since he received that note from Lily, refused to let go. He had spent his entire life feeling like something was missing. And now, standing on the other side of a single door was the answer. He turned the knob. The door creaked open just an inch, and Michael hesitated before slowly pulling it wider. A figure stood in the dim hallway, the flickering light casting long shadows against the peeling walls. And for the first time in his life, Michael came face to face with himself. Eli. It was like looking in a mirror, but not quite. The same dark hair, the same deep-set eyes. But there was something different about him. Something in the way he held himself, rigid, calculating. His gaze carried a weight that Michael's never had. Like he had seen things Michael never would. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Eli tilted his head slightly, his lips curving into something that was almost a smile but not quite. "You finally found me," he murmured. Michael's throat went dry. He tried to speak, but no words came. Eli took a slow step forward, his eyes scanning the apartment behind Michael as if he were searching for something. "I wasn't sure you ever would," he continued. "Mom kept you well hidden. She did a good job." Michael's breath caught. You knew about me?" Eli let out a quiet, humorless chuckle. "Of course I knew about you. I've always known about you. The question is, how much do you know about me? Michael's fingers clenched at his sides. His mind was still struggling to catch up with what was happening, but he forced himself to focus. I know we were separated, he said, his voice rough. I know Mom took me and left you behind. I just don't know why. Eli's expression darkened. That's because she never wanted you to. Michael's stomach twisted. Tell me. Eli studied him for a long moment. Then he exhaled sharply, stepping further into the apartment and closing the door behind him. All right, he said, but you're not going to like it. Michael's entire body tensed as Eli moved toward the small, dusty couch and lowered himself onto it like he had done it 1,000 times before. Like he belonged here. He gestured for Michael to sit. Michael hesitated for only a second before doing the same. The air between them felt charged, thick with something unspoken. Then Eli leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his dark eyes locked onto Michael's. There's a reason you don't remember me, he said. A reason I don't exist in any records. Michael's pulse pounded. Eli's voice was calm, but there was something underneath it, something sharp. Because you weren't supposed to. Michael's breath hitched. What do you mean? Eli tilted his head slightly. You ever feel like something's missing? Like there's a part of you that's just gone? Michael swallowed hard. Yes. Eli nodded slowly. That's because there is. The words sent a chill down Michael's spine. I wasn't just erased from the records, Michael, Eli continued. I was erased from you. Michael felt his entire world tilt. That doesn't make sense. It will. Eli sat back, his gaze never leaving Michael's. Our mother. She loved you. She did everything she could to protect you. She made sure you were safe, happy. She gave you a good life. He paused. But me. He let out a quiet breath. I was the mistake. Michael's stomach twisted. That's not true. Eli's lips curved into a smirk, but there was no humor in it. Isn't it? He leaned forward again. Tell me, Michael, how do you think we ended up separated? Do you think she just forgot about me? Michael felt his chest tighten. I don't know. That's why I'm asking. Eli's expression hardened. Because she chose to. The words hit Michael like a blow. No, he said automatically, shaking his head. She wouldn't. But she did. Eli interrupted. She chose to take you and leave me behind. And do you know why? Michael's hands clenched into fists. Tell me. Eli exhaled slowly, as if savoring the moment. Then, finally, he said, because I remembered. Michael's skin prickled. Remembered what? Eli studied him carefully, his gaze piercing. The things they did to us. Michael felt something cold settle in his chest. What are you talking about? Eli tilted his head. How much do you remember about your childhood? Michael hesitated. Not much. Exactly. A heavy silence filled the space between them. You were lucky, Eli murmured. She gave you a new life, a new name. She made sure you forgot. But I wasn't so lucky. I remembered everything, and they couldn't have that. Michael's heart pounded. Who's they? Eli smiled, but it wasn't a smile at all. You'll find out soon enough. Michael felt his breath stall. His mind raced with questions, but before he could ask them, Eli pushed himself to his feet. I should go, he said. Michael shot up after him. Wait. Eli turned to face him, his expression unreadable. You wanted answers, he said. Now you have them. Michael's chest tightened. That's not enough. Eli studied him for a long moment, then sighed. All right, he said. One more thing. Michael swallowed hard. Eli's voice was quiet when he spoke again. Whatever you do, he said, don't go back to the Andersons' house. Michael's blood ran cold. Before he could respond, Eli turned and walked out the door, disappearing into the night. Michael stood there, his entire body tense. His mind screamed at him to chase after him, to demand more answers. But he couldn't move, because deep down he knew. Eli wasn't warning him. He was daring him. And Michael had never been one to back down from a dare. Michael stood frozen long after Eli had disappeared into the night. The door remained slightly ajar, the cool air slipping through the gap, but he barely noticed. His mind was reeling, trying to grasp the weight of what had just happened. A brother he had never known, a past that had been deliberately erased, and a warning, no, a challenge, not to go back to the Andersons' house. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Every instinct in his body screamed that Eli was hiding something, that there was more to the story than he was letting on, and Michael wasn't about to let it go. He turned back to the coffee table, where the file from the Andersons' basement still sat. The pages were slightly crumpled from his earlier grip, his own name standing out in bold ink. But now it wasn't just his name that haunted him, it was Eli's. How had he never known? How had an entire person, his own twin, been erased from his life without a trace? And why? His eyes scanned the documents again, searching for anything he might have missed before. Then something caught his attention, an address. Not the Andersons' house, somewhere else. Place he didn't recognize. His heart pounded as he grabbed his keys. He didn't know what he would find there, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to stop until he had the truth. The address led him to the outskirts of town, where the streetlights were dim and the houses were older, smaller, worn down by time. The place wasn't abandoned, but it felt forgotten, tucked away from the world like a secret no one wanted to remember. Michael parked across the street, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as he stared at the house. The windows were dark. The paint was peeling. It looked like no one had lived there in years, but someone had, and whoever they were connected to him. He stepped out of the car, his breath visible in the cold night air. The pavement beneath his feet felt unsteady, as if the world itself was shifting beneath him. He approached the house slowly, his pulse quickening with every step. The mailbox was rusted, the numbers barely legible. He reached out, his fingers hesitating before brushing against the doorbell. Then the front door creaked open. Michael's breath stalled. A woman stood in the doorway, her face partially hidden by the shadows. Her hair was streaked with gray, her eyes sharp, filled with something that looked like recognition. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice low. Michael swallowed hard. "Who are you?" The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. "The real question is, who are you?" Michael's stomach tightened. The woman stepped forward, and for the first time, he saw something in her expression that made his blood run cold. She knew him, not just as a stranger on her doorstep. She knew him. His breath hitched. "Please," he said, "I just need answers." The woman hesitated. Then, with a slow sigh, she stepped aside. "Come in." Michael hesitated for only a second before stepping into the house. The air inside was thick with dust and something else. Something heavier, something unspoken. The walls were lined with old photographs, faded and yellowed with age. He could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. The woman closed the door behind them, locking it with a quiet click. Michael turned to face her. "You knew my mother," he said. It wasn't a question. The woman studied him for a long moment. "I did," she finally admitted. "A long time ago." Michael's pulse pounded. "And Eli?" A shadow passed over her face. "I knew him too." Michael clenched his fists. "Then tell me what happened. Why was he erased? Why don't I remember him?" The woman exhaled slowly. "Because they made sure you wouldn't." Michael's skin prickled. "Who's they?" She hesitated. Then, finally, she said, "The Andersons." Michael's breath stalled. No, that wasn't possible. Emma and Jack Anderson? The couple whose daughter had given him that desperate note? They had been involved in his past? "That doesn't make sense," he said, shaking his head. "I've never met them before last week." The woman's gaze was unwavering. "Haven't you?" Michael's mouth went dry. Something about the way she said it sent a deep, piercing chill through him. "Sit," she said, gesturing toward the worn-out couch. Michael did as he was told, his heart pounding in his chest. The woman sat across from him, folding her hands in her lap. She studied him for a long moment before finally speaking. "Eli was never supposed to survive," she said softly. Michael's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" The woman's expression was unreadable. You were the chosen one, Michael. Your mother was meant to take you and leave him behind. That was the deal. Michael's head spun. Deal? What deal? The woman exhaled. Your family wasn't normal, Michael. They were part of something bigger, something most people will never understand. Your mother tried to break away from it. She tried to save you. Michael's chest ached. And Eli? The woman's expression darkened. Eli wasn't supposed to leave. Michael felt sick. Then how is he still alive? The woman's gaze met his. Because he found a way out. Michael swallowed hard. And the Andersons? The woman hesitated. They were part of it too. Jack, Emma. They knew the truth. They helped cover it up. They helped erase him. Michael's pulse roared in his ears. Why? The woman's lips parted. But before she could speak, something outside made them both freeze. A car. Headlights flashed through the thin curtains. Michael's heart pounded as he turned toward the window. The Andersons' car was parked in front of the house. Emma Anderson was stepping out, and she was looking straight at him. Michael's breath hitched as his eyes locked onto Emma Anderson standing outside. The dim glow of the street lamp cast long shadows across her face. But even from a distance, he could see the sharp intensity in her expression. She wasn't just looking at the house. She was looking directly at him, as if she had known all along that he would end up here, as if she had been waiting. His pulse thundered in his ears. He turned sharply back to the woman inside, whose own face had paled at the sight of Emma. You need to leave, the woman said, her voice tight. Michael shook his head. Not until I get answers. The woman exhaled sharply, glancing toward the door as if she expected it to burst open at any second. You don't understand. If she's here, that means they know. They're already watching you. You've gone too far. Michael felt a chill crawl up his spine. Who's they? But before she could respond, there was a sharp knock at the door. Michael's entire body went rigid. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. His mouth went dry. He could feel the woman's fear thick, suffocating. She was already shaking her head, backing away toward the dimly lit hallway. I can't be part of this, she whispered. You were never supposed to find me. I tried to warn her, but she didn't listen. And now, neither will you. Michael's heart pounded. Who? The woman's eyes flickered with something almost like pity. Your mother. The words sent a jolt through him. But before he could process them, the knocks came again. Louder this time. Emma's voice drifted through the thin wooden door. Michael, I know you're in there. Michael's chest tightened. Every part of him screamed that this was a mistake, that he shouldn't open that door. But he needed to face her. He needed to know the truth. His fingers curled around the doorknob, and with one slow breath, he turned it. Emma stood just outside, her posture unnervingly calm. She was dressed perfectly. As always, her blonde hair pinned back, her expensive coat wrapped around her shoulders. She looked untouched by the night, as if she hadn't spent the past few days unraveling like he had. But her eyes told a different story. There was no surprise in them, no shock that he had found this place. Just quiet knowing. You shouldn't have come here, she said softly. Michael clenched his jaw. I think I should be the one saying that. Emma tilted her head slightly, her gaze unreadable. Do you even know what you're looking for? Michael's pulse pounded. The truth. She let out a quiet breath, almost like a sigh, as if she had expected that answer. And what makes you think you're ready for it? Michael's grip tightened on the door. I don't care if I'm ready. I care that I finally know. Emma studied him for a long moment. Then, she stepped past the threshold, moving into the dimly lit house without an invitation, her heels clicking softly against the wooden floor. Michael instinctively stepped back as she moved past him, her gaze sweeping over the room, taking in every detail. The old furniture, the dust-lined walls, the faint remnants of a life that had once existed here. The woman who had let him in was nowhere to be seen. Emma exhaled, shaking her head slightly. She shouldn't have told you anything. Michael clenched his fists. She barely told me anything at all. Emma finally turned to face him fully, and for the first time he saw something different in her. She wasn't just calm. She was tired. She studied him carefully, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You don't remember anything, do you?" Michael's jaw tightened. "No, because someone made sure I wouldn't." Emma nodded slowly, as if confirming something to herself. "And yet you've come all this way, even after I warned you." Michael swallowed hard. "Why do you care so much about what I remember?" Emma's gaze darkened. "Because the past isn't what you think it is." Michael's stomach twisted. "Then tell me what it is." Emma was silent for a long time. The air between them felt heavy, thick with the weight of everything unsaid. Then finally she spoke. "You and Eli were never meant to be separated," she said. "That wasn't part of the original plan." Michael's heart pounded. "Plan?" Emma exhaled. "Your mother wanted to save you, both of you, but she was given a choice, and she made it." Michael's chest tightened. "She chose me." Emma nodded. "Yes, but she didn't just leave Eli behind. She traded him." Michael's blood ran cold. "Traded him?" His voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. Emma didn't look away. "For you." Michael felt the floor sway beneath him. His mother hadn't just left Eli. She had bargained for Michael's life. Michael shook his head, his breath uneven. "That doesn't make any sense." Who would she even trade him to?" Emma's expression was unreadable. "People who don't exist on paper. People who make sure the things they do are never found." Michael swallowed hard. His mind was racing, trying to piece it all together. His mother had saved him. But at what cost? He took a shaky step back. "And the Andersons? Where do you fit into all of this?" Emma hesitated. "Jack and I, we weren't always who we are now. We used to be different people. We had different lives. Until we were given a responsibility we didn't ask for." Michael's hands curled into fists. "Lily." Emma's jaw tightened slightly. "Yes, Lily." Michael's pulse pounded. "And what about Eli?" Emma exhaled. "Eli was supposed to disappear, but he didn't." Michael's breath stalled. "He escaped," Emma murmured. "And now, he wants you to remember." A cold wave of realization settled over Michael. Eli hadn't just come back to find him. He had come back to finish something. Michael's throat felt dry. "Why? Why now?" Emma's gaze held something close to sorrow. "Because you found Lily." Michael's skin prickled. Emma stepped closer, her voice lowering. "And she remembers more than she should." Michael's stomach twisted. "What are you saying?" Emma exhaled sharply. "Lily isn't just remembering Eli. She's remembering everything. And if that happens..." She trailed off. Michael felt his pulse hammer. "If that happens, what?" Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "Then the past won't stay buried." Michael's breath caught. And for the first time since this all began, he realized that maybe he didn't want to remember. But it was too late, because the past was already clawing its way back. Michael felt the weight of Emma's words settle deep in his chest, like a stone sinking into the depths of a dark ocean. The past won't stay buried. That was the warning. But it wasn't just a warning. It was a truth that had been creeping toward him since the night he delivered that pizza. Since Lily's desperate note found its way into his hands. Since the pieces of a forgotten life had begun falling into place. His breath came unsteadily as he tried to process everything. His mother had made a deal, a choice that had saved him and doomed Eli. Emma and Jack weren't just an ordinary couple with marital problems. They were part of something bigger, something hidden beneath years of lies and manipulation. And now Lily was remembering. She was the key. Emma's voice was soft but firm, cutting through the storm in Michael's head. "You need to stop looking for answers." Michael let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You think I can just walk away from this now?" Emma's gaze was steady. "I think you have no idea what you're walking into." Michael clenched his jaw. "Then tell me what happens if Lily remembers everything." Emma exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over her face, as if she were trying to piece together something too big, too fragile to handle carelessly. "If she remembers," she said finally, It will unravel everything. The past. The present. You. Michael's pulse pounded. What do you mean, me? Emma hesitated, something flickering in her expression. You're already starting to remember, aren't you? Michael swallowed hard. Flashes of something he couldn't quite grasp had been surfacing lately. Fragmented images in his mind, feelings that didn't belong to him but somehow felt like his own. A house he didn't recognize but felt eerily familiar. A name whispered in the back of his mind. Eli. Emma watched him closely, as if she could see the thoughts running through him. The truth isn't just about Eli, Michael. It's about you. What you were. What you became. Michael shook his head. You keep talking in circles. Just tell me. Emma's lips pressed into a thin line. It's not that simple. Michael's patience snapped. It's always not that simple with you. Isn't it? First, it's that I don't know what I'm looking for. Then it's that I'm not ready for the truth. And now you're telling me I don't even know who I am. Emma's expression didn't waver. Yes. Michael sucked in a sharp breath. Emma sighed, her posture softening just slightly. Listen to me, Michael. I know you think you're getting closer to the truth. But the closer you get, the more dangerous this becomes. And once you open that door, you won't be able to close it again. Michael's jaw tightened. Then maybe it's time to open it. Emma's face darkened. Then you better be prepared for what's on the other side. A tense silence filled the room. Then, before either of them could speak again, Michael's phone buzzed in his pocket. He hesitated before pulling it out, glancing at the screen. Unknown number. His stomach twisted. He answered. Hello. Silence. Then, a small voice. Soft. Hesitant. Michael. Michael's blood ran cold. Lily. His grip on the phone tightened. Lily? Where are you? A shaky breath on the other end. I don't know. I think they're coming for me. Michael's pulse thundered. Who's coming for you? The line crackled. Then, just before the call dropped, Lily's voice barely above a whisper. Eli. The call went dead. Michael's heart slammed against his ribs. He turned sharply to Emma, his breath uneven. Where's Lily? Emma's face had gone pale. She's at the hospital. Under watch. Michael clenched his fists. Not anymore. Emma didn't hesitate. She turned, already moving for the door. Get in the car. Now. Michael followed without question, his thoughts racing. Lily was gone, and Eli had taken her. The hospital parking lot was eerily quiet when they arrived, the fluorescent lights casting an unnatural glow over the pavement. Emma barely put the car in park before she was out the door, moving with a precision that told Michael she had been prepared for this moment long before it happened. They stormed through the entrance, past the late-night nurses who barely glanced up, down the long, sterile hallways toward Lily's room. Michael's breath was tight in his chest, his mind cycling through every possibility of what they would find. But when they reached the room, the door was open, empty. The bed was neatly made. The machines were silent. The 4 poles stood untouched, as if Lily had never been there at all. Michael's stomach dropped. Where is she? He demanded, turning to Emma. Emma's eyes scanned the room, her fingers twitching at her sides. Then, without a word, she moved toward the window. Michael followed her gaze. Across the street, just beyond the glow of the parking lot lights, stood a figure. Eli. And in his arms, wrapped in a small hospital blanket, was Lily. Michael's breath hitched. Eli met his gaze from across the distance. And then, slowly, deliberately, he turned and disappeared into the darkness. Michael didn't think. He ran. He heard Emma shout after him, but he didn't stop. His feet pounded against the pavement as he bolted out of the hospital, toward where Eli had stood. But by the time he reached the street, Eli and Lily were gone. Michael's hands clenched into fists. His breath was ragged, his chest burning. Eli had taken her. Michael turned sharply as Emma caught up to him, her breath coming fast. We need to think this through, she said. But Michael shook his head. There's no time. Emma exhaled sharply. Michael, listen to me. This isn't just about Lily anymore. This is about you. About Eli. About why he brought you into this. Michael's chest ached. I don't care about any of that right now. I just want to get her back. Emma studied him for a long moment. Then finally she nodded. Then we find Eli. Michael swallowed hard. But deep down he knew Eli had already found them. Michael could feel his pulse hammering as he stood in the empty hospital parking lot, his breath coming in ragged, uneven gasps. Eli was gone, and he had taken Lily with him. The weight of that realization pressed against his chest, suffocating, unbearable. He had spent the past few days unraveling the mystery of a past he didn't remember, uncovering pieces of himself that had been buried under years of lies. But none of it mattered now, because Lily was in danger. Emma was already on her phone, her voice sharp, controlled. We need a trace on his last known location, she said to whoever was on the other end. I don't care how, just find him. She hung up, turning to Michael with a look that told him she was barely holding herself together. We don't have much time. Michael's mind was racing. Where would he take her? Emma exhaled. If he's trying to make you remember, then he's taking her somewhere connected to you. Somewhere you've been before. Michael clenched his jaw. But I don't remember. Emma stared at him for a long moment. Then it's time you do. Michael ran a hand through his hair, frustration burning in his chest. That's not how it works, Emma. I don't have control over what I remember. I can't just force it. Then let me help you. Michael's eyes snapped to hers. There was something in her gaze. Something raw, something desperate. What do you mean? Emma took a slow breath. There's a reason I've been telling you not to look too closely. A reason I didn't want you to remember too soon. Michael felt his stomach twist. What are you saying? Emma hesitated. Then finally she spoke. You didn't just forget Eli. You were made to forget him. Michael's breath stalled. What? Emma's voice was barely above a whisper. Someone erased him from you, Michael. And not just him. Everything. Michael took a step back, his pulse roaring in his ears. That's not possible. Emma exhaled sharply. Isn't it? Michael shook his head, trying to make sense of it. But why? Why would someone do that? Emma hesitated. Then, quietly, she said, Because you asked them to. The words hit Michael like a punch to the gut. He felt his breath catch, his body locking into place. No, he said, shaking his head. That doesn't make sense. You did, Emma said softly. Because you saw something. You learned something that you weren't supposed to, and you wanted to forget. Michael's entire body went cold. He had been the one to erase Eli, his own twin. His mind reeled, memories flickering at the edges of his consciousness. Blurry but there, just out of reach. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to grasp onto them, but they slipped through his fingers like sand. And then, suddenly, it hit him. A place he had seen before. A house. The abandoned house. His eyes snapped open. I know where he took her. Emma's breath hitched. Where? Michael turned to her, his chest tightening. The house. The one in the file. The one connected to me. Emma paled. You can't go there. Michael's jaw clenched. I don't have a choice. Emma's voice sharpened. Michael, you don't understand. If you go back there, you might not come out the same person. Michael took a step toward her. Lily doesn't have time for me to figure out who I am. Emma. Emma's hands curled into fists. Then I'm going with you. Michael hesitated. Emma held his gaze. You're not doing this alone. Michael swallowed hard. Then he nodded. And together they drove toward the past. The house was waiting for them. It stood at the end of a long, forgotten road, hidden beneath a canopy of towering trees. The air was thick, heavy with something that felt like a warning. The structure itself was old, worn by time, the paint peeling from the walls like dead skin. But Michael knew this place. He didn't know how, but he did. His chest tightened as he stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath his feet. Emma followed close behind, her eyes scanning the darkened windows, her body tense. Are you sure? She whispered. Michael nodded. And then, without another word, he walked toward the door. The handle was ice-cold beneath his fingers. The moment he touched it, a sharp pain sliced through his head, brief, blinding. He gasped, gripping the doorframe for balance. "Michael!" Emma's voice was sharp with concern. Michael's breathing was uneven. "I'm fine." But he wasn't, because for a split second he had remembered something. A scream, a child's scream. Michael forced the thought down and pushed the door open. The house smelled like dust and something else. Something older, something rotten. The wooden floor creaked beneath their steps as they moved inside, the walls covered in faint, peeling wallpaper. Michael's heart pounded as his eyes adjusted to the darkness. And then, from upstairs, a small voice. "Michael!" Michael's breath caught. "Lily!" He didn't think. He ran. Emma called after him, but he barely heard her. He bolted up the stairs, his hands gripping the railing as he took them two at a time. The hallway stretched before him, too long, too dark. The doors on either side were closed, but one was slightly ajar. Michael's chest ached as he pushed it open. And there, sitting in the middle of the empty room, was Lily. Her small body was curled into itself, her hospital gown still loose around her frame. She was clutching something in her hands, a torn photograph. Her blue eyes lifted to meet his, filled with something Michael couldn't quite place. Then, she whispered, "He's here." Michael's breath stalled. A shadow shifted behind her, and Eli stepped forward. His twin, his reflection, but not quite. His face was unreadable, his dark eyes scanning Michael carefully, like he was trying to decide something. "You made it," Eli murmured. Michael's hands clenched at his sides. "Let her go." Eli tilted his head slightly. "You still don't remember, do you?" Michael's jaw tightened. "I remember enough." Eli let out a quiet laugh. "No, you don't." Then he took another step forward, and the walls of the house seemed to shift, the air growing heavier. Michael's stomach twisted, and suddenly, he remembered everything. The moment Michael's mind unlocked the memories that had been buried for years, a sharp pain shot through his skull like lightning. His breath hitched, his vision blurred, and suddenly, it was as if the present had collapsed around him, dragging him backward into the past. The walls of the abandoned house flickered, shifting like mirages, peeling away layers of time to reveal what had been hidden beneath. The air felt heavier, pressing against his chest, suffocating him with the weight of forgotten history. He staggered, gripping the doorframe, his heartbeat pounding like a war drum. And then, he saw it. The memory was so vivid it felt real. A child, himself no older than 5, standing in this very room. But he wasn't alone. Eli stood beside him. Michael's breath caught as he watched the past unfold before his eyes. The room wasn't empty like it was now. There were toys scattered across the wooden floor, the faint smell of something sweet lingering in the air. And then footsteps. A woman entered. Their mother. Michael barely recognized her. She looked younger, her features softer, but there was fear in her eyes. She knelt in front of them, her hands trembling as she gripped Michael's shoulders. "You have to listen to me," she whispered. "No matter what happens, you have to forget." Michael felt a deep, twisting ache in his chest as he watched himself, the child version of him, shake his head, confusion flickering in his innocent eyes. "Forget what?" young Michael had asked. But before their mother could answer, another figure appeared in the doorway. A man. Michael's body tensed. He couldn't see the man's face, but he could feel the presence, the cold authority radiating off of him. He spoke, his voice deep, measured. "It's time." Michael's mother flinched. "Please," she begged. "Don't do this. Don't take them both." The man didn't respond. Instead, his gaze shifted to the twins. "One of them will stay. The other will be erased." Michael felt his stomach drop. He remembered now. This was the moment it had happened. The moment his life had been split in two. The moment his twin had been taken from him. Not in death, not by accident, but by a choice. His mother had been given a decision, and she had chosen Michael. His breath came in uneven gasps as he watched his mother break. Watched the way her hands trembled as she reached for him instead of Eli. "I'm sorry," she had whispered, and then Eli had been pulled away. Michael staggered back into the present, his mind spinning, the weight of the truth pressing against his ribs. His eyes locked onto Eli, his twin, the brother he had lost, the shadow of himself that had never been allowed to exist. Eli stared at him, and for the first time Michael truly saw him, not just as a mystery or a threat, but as a child who had been abandoned, a soul that had been forgotten. "You understand now," Eli murmured. Michael's breath was shaky. "They took you. They erased you." Eli nodded, his expression unreadable. "And you let them." Michael's stomach twisted. "I was a kid, Eli. I didn't know." "You didn't want to know," Eli cut in sharply. "You let them make you forget. You let them take my life and pretend it never happened. And now, after all these years, you come looking for answers as if you deserve them." Michael swallowed hard. "That's not fair." "Fair?" Eli let out a bitter laugh. "Fair would have been growing up together. Fair would have been having a choice. But I never got that, Michael. I was erased." His voice cracked, raw with something deeper than anger. Pain, grief, betrayal. "Do you know what it's like to be a ghost? To be nothing?" Michael's throat tightened. Eli exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You were the lucky one, Michael. You got a mother who loved you, a life, a chance." His gaze darkened. "But you don't deserve it more than I did." Michael took a slow step forward, his voice quiet. "Lily isn't part of this, Eli. She's just a kid." Eli's jaw tightened. "So were we." Michael clenched his fists. "You don't have to do this." Eli's eyes burned with something fierce. "Don't I?" For a long, heavy moment, silence filled the space between them. Then, a small voice broke through the tension. "Lily!" Emma's voice called from behind them. Michael turned just as Emma appeared in the doorway, her eyes scanning the room before locking onto the little girl sitting on the floor. Lily looked up, her blue eyes wide, confused. She clutched the torn photograph in her hands, the same one Michael had seen before. It was a picture of two boys, twins, Eli and Michael. Lily's gaze flickered between them, realization dawning in her young eyes. "You're the same," she whispered. Eli flinched slightly. Michael swallowed hard, crouching down to Lily's level. "It's okay," he said gently. "You're safe now." Lily looked at Eli again, her small hands tightening around the photograph. Eli didn't move. His eyes softened just slightly as he watched her. And in that moment, Michael saw something crack inside of him. Not anger, not hatred, but sorrow. Deep, bone-deep sorrow. Eli had spent his whole life fighting for a place in the world, for an existence that had been stolen from him. He had fought so hard to be remembered, to be real. And now, here was this little girl, this innocent child, looking at him, seeing him, not as a ghost, not as a shadow, but as a person. Eli's hands curled into fists at his sides. He let out a slow, unsteady breath. Then, quietly, he whispered, "Take her." Michael's breath stalled. Emma didn't hesitate. She moved swiftly, scooping Lily into her arms, holding her tightly against her chest. Eli took a step back. Michael's chest ached. "Eli," but Eli shook his head. "This isn't your choice to make, Michael. It never was." His voice softened. "I just wanted you to know. I just wanted someone to remember." Michael's throat tightened. "I do. I remember." Eli gave him a small, sad smile. "Good." Then, without another word, he turned and walked into the darkness. Michael wanted to call after him, but somehow he knew Eli had already made his choice. And maybe, for the first time in his life, he was finally free. Michael exhaled shakily, watching as his brother faded into the night. He would never be erased again, and neither would Michael, because now he remembered, and the past would never be forgotten.